I know I harp on this a lot, but a new article reinforces what I've been saying all along about the dangers of social isolation. Hello, and welcome to another episode of You and Me and Multiple Sclerosis. My name is Pam, and I've been living with multiple sclerosis for 38 and a half years. Well, as you know, I've done a number of videos about the importance of our maintaining good general health in order to combat the symptoms of multiple sclerosis and perhaps even slow its progression. Well, I just saw an article that isn't specific to multiple sclerosis, but once you read the title of it, you're going to see how if the danger exists for the general population, it would certainly exist for those of us with multiple sclerosis. This was the article that just came out in MedPage today, and it's dated July 12, 2023. It's titled Social Isolation Tied to Brain Volume in Older Adults. And of course, even though it's not specific to MS, that caught my attention because, as you know, brain volume loss is a big deal in multiple sclerosis. The subtitle says relationship between brain atrophy and social contact may be a vicious cycle. You just gotta read that, don't you? Says here, frequency of social contact was tied to brain volume in cognitively normal older adults. A cross-sectional study in Japan showed the total brain volume was smaller in people who had the lowest frequency of social contact versus those with the highest frequency, 67.3% versus 67.8%, reported Toshihara Ninomiya, MD, of Kyushu University in Fukuoka, and co-authors in Neurology. And in a minute, I'll click on that Neurology article just so you can see the original source. It says less social contact was linked with smaller temporal lobe, occipital lobe, cingulum, hippocampus, and amygdala volumes. So major parts of the brain that do very important things are smaller because you have less social contact. That's kind of scary. White matter lesion volume increased with fewer social interactions from 0.26% in the most social group to 0.3% in the least. It may not seem like a lot right there, but consider the fact that even minute changes in your brain can make a big difference. We all know that. And so these numbers apparently are statistically significant. It says relationships between social contact and brain volumes appear to be partially mediated by depressive symptoms, which could be a potential mechanism underlying the link between social isolation and cognitive function or dementia, the researchers said. And physiologically, the autopsied brains of dementia patients bear a lot of resemblance to those of people with advanced multiple sclerosis. So some of the mechanisms are similar, perhaps not identical, but similar. The findings are in line with recent data from the Framingham study, which found that dementia incidence tripled in lonely older adults who otherwise were expected to have relatively low risk. A longitudinal analysis of UK biobank participants also linked social isolation with lower brain volume and a higher risk of subsequent dementia. So low brain volume and dementia are linked. I think that's an important finding right there. Loneliness and social isolation are serious public health risks, especially in older adults, noted Alexa Walter, PhD, and Danielle Sandsmark, MD, PhD, both of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, in an accompanying editorial. A National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report found that more than 1/4 of adults over 65 years are socially isolated, Walter and Sandsmark wrote. Social isolation has been associated with a variety of negative health outcomes, including premature mortality, increased risk of coronary heart disease and stroke, increased reporting of depressive symptoms, as well as increased dementia risk and cognitive decline. And I just want to point out here that those of us with multiple sclerosis, even if it doesn't seem all that far advanced, even if we can still walk, even if we're still able to do what we want to do around the house, isolation becomes more and more of a temptation the further along you are with MS or the longer you've lived with it. It's just more trouble to get ready and go out and interact with people than most of us really feel like we have the energy for. But that is such a danger. Social isolation and all of the things it's associated with is a really serious problem and something that we need to work hard to be sure we don't find ourselves falling into. They go on to say that Ninomiya and co-authors evaluated MRI and survey data from 8,896 dementia-free participants in the ongoing Japan Prospective Studies Collaboration for Aging and Dementia. Women comprised 57% of the study group, which had a mean age of 73. That's a large sample size again. Participants rated their frequency of social contact as every day, several times a week, several times a month, or seldom. They answered questions about depression, educational level, marital status, living situation, and occupation. The survey also asked about regular medications, including antihypertensive or antidiabetic drugs, medical history, smoking, and exercise. Cognitive function was higher in participants who had daily social contact compared with those who had least contact, 28 versus 27 on the mini-mental state examination. Scores between 25 and 30 are considered normal. Depressive symptoms were lower in the daily contact group compared with the seldom contact groups. Less social contact was also associated with lower education, unemployment, hypertension, smoking, alcohol use, and a history of cardiovascular disease. Each one of those probably would require its own, more intensive study, I would think. Mediation analysis suggested that 15% to 29% of the associations between frequency of social contact and each brain volume were mediated by depressive symptoms. In other words, depression can make a big difference. And we've talked about that, how MS fatigue and MS depression kind of go hand in hand, and it's hard to know where one stops and the other begins. The direct effects of social contact frequency on brain volume ranged between 71% to 85%, the model hypothesized. Several mechanisms may explain the link between low social contact and brain atrophy, Ninomiya and colleagues noted. Socially isolated individuals were more prone to have diabetes mellitus, hypertension, and unhealthy lifestyles, including smoking and physical inactivity, they observed. And as you may remember, I've covered a couple of those factors in some of my videos on preserving our general health. Certainly, smoking and physical inactivity are very bad for us. And they go on to say decreased cognitive stimulation due to less social contact may cause brain atrophy, the researchers suggested. Fewer social interactions also could be an early symptom of structural brain changes like atrophy or white matter lesions, they pointed out. And I would just pause here a minute and say, what causes what? Fewer social interactions cause brain atrophy. Structural changes in the brain maybe make you less inclined to interact socially. But I think it's a vicious circle. Either way it starts, it gets worse and worse depending on what you do with it. Whether you persist in maintaining some social connection or whether you just decide it's easier to isolate yourself and just stay home. Since the present analysis had a cross-sectional design, causal interpretation of the association between low frequency of social contact and brain atrophy should be avoided, the researchers said. Rather, it is expected that the relationship between low frequency of social contact and brain atrophy may be bidirectional, with a vicious cycle existing between social isolation, brain atrophy, and cognitive function decline, they noted. As I just pointed out, either way it starts, you end up in the same place. The analysis had other limitations, the researchers acknowledged. The survey did not collect information about loneliness, and findings may not apply to younger populations. Okay, well, those are the disclaimers, but still, the findings of the study are important and they're quite attention-getting. And again, it's something that we have some control over, so I really wanted to share this because you can be thinking about whether your level of social connection is everything that you might want it to be. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And this is the article that you would get if you clicked on the neurology link that we talked about a minute ago. This is the original article, and I am not going to go through it because the report we just read contains a sufficient amount of detail that we really don't gain a lot more by looking at this. But I will put the link in my description just so that if in case you want to go back to the original study, you can see it. Okay, all well and fine, you're saying, but what research has been done about multiple sclerosis and social isolation? Well, ask no more. Here we go. I'll just show you really quickly. There's been research done, and it pretty much reinforces the same things we saw in the article I just talked about. You can take my word for it. There are a lot of research papers on the subject, specifically social interaction and multiple sclerosis. I'll link the results of the search that I did on that topic so you can browse them if you wish. The only one I'm going to look at really quickly here is one from Neurologica that came out in July of 2020. The impact of social capital on patients with multiple sclerosis. And my interest here is partially the list of authors, because if you don't recognize anybody else, you're going to recognize the last name on there, Gavin Giovannoni, because I talk about him a lot, and you probably also have heard some of his presentations, his videos. You've maybe even subscribed to his blog, and if you don't, I would highly recommend that. But he, like everybody else, is saying social isolation is bad for people with MS, and social connection is good. It can help us slow the progression of our disease. It can help us with our symptoms because we're less depressed, and depression is not good for multiple sclerosis. Well, lest you think I'm just going to leave you feeling badly about the dangers of social isolation and not knowing what to do about it, let's take a look at some tips for overcoming social isolation when you have multiple sclerosis. There's quite a lot of information about how to cope with social isolation when you have multiple sclerosis, but I decided we would just look at this one from an app called bezzyms, BEZZYMS. It's 6 tips for coping with social isolation and multiple sclerosis. It was published in May of 2020. And as I say, living with MS can feel isolating, but putting yourself out there can go a long way. I thought this first paragraph was interesting. It says that feeling lonely and isolated is common among people living with multiple sclerosis, and according to a 2018 survey by the Multiple Sclerosis Society, 60% of people living with MS experience loneliness as a result of their condition. And by that, it doesn't necessarily mean you always feel lonely or that your loneliness leads to depression. But truly, I would say at least 60% of us have felt lonely at some time or another because of our MS and the limitations that we live with every day. They say that staying connected to others while managing the symptoms of MS is no easy task, but if you're able, it can benefit you immensely. In fact, a recent study found that having strong personal relationships can help lower the physical and psychological toll of MS. Nothing really new there, but it's always good to hear it over again. Here are the tips that they give. I'll just go over these pretty quickly with you because they are just some of many that you could come up with it has to work for you. First of all, I must say, it has to work for you because not everybody's going to feel like they can or even want to do some of these things that we are suggesting here, but they might give you some ideas that could get your mind thinking about, maybe I couldn't do that exactly, but I could do this other thing. The first thing they talk about is sticking to a routine. And I think the main reason that this is good is that if you don't have a routine, you're always going to feel like you haven't got your act together, and how could you even possibly consider doing any kind of a social activity, whether it's inviting someone in or going out. That often will end up costing you a good chunk of the day. Here's an interesting one. Accept support and do something you dream about. And this person says, I spent years in isolation. I had my family, but I was terrified of social interaction and being left vulnerable in front of others. It helps if you can have a support person nearby, but try going out. Do something you dream about, even if it's just to go watch people do it. And I think that's a really good suggestion. My husband actually is my support person in that sense. I feel a lot more brave, I guess I would say, about going into situations that I'm not familiar with if he's with me. It's harder to do that if he's not. I do go places with friends, but even then sometimes I feel a little vulnerable. I like that word vulnerable because I would say that describes pretty much how I feel. I don't know that there's going to be someone there who understands what I might be thinking or feeling and looks out for me a little bit proactively, because I know I don't mind asking for help, but it's sure nice when it's offered without my having to ask. But I do think this idea of something you dream about, don't just automatically assume you can no longer do it just because you have MS. One of the things that we've done recently is buy ourselves a little camper. And we're going to start taking that out whenever we even find that we have some time and just do a little camping. In the past, that was always associated with long walks in various places around the Northwest, and that was wonderful. I can't do that anymore, but I can go camping. I can stay in the trailer or sit in a chair outside. I can enjoy being out in the wilderness and the sights and the smells and the sounds. And I think that would really enrich my life. And with my husband there to help me, I think is very doable. So it is something I've dreamed about. It's something I've missed. And I am going to be taking that on. And I will be letting you know how that turns out for me. But I am very optimistic. And another one that I've mentioned a number of times, they suggest join a group. They say we must make an effort to get out there. And they give you different examples. I have talked about an MS support group if you have one nearby. Our support group, which actually is based in New York State, and as you know, I'm in Washington State, we have decided to start meeting online because a number of us have mobility issues, and the weather in upstate New York is pretty snowy in the wintertime, shall we say. So it's just worked out better for us to meet online, and we've used Zoom, we've used Skype, we've used Google Meetup, we've used Facebook. Whatever can work for you, it definitely makes a difference because you're talking with other folks who also have MS and they understand what you're going through, and you can encourage them as they can encourage you. It's really kind of nice. But even a group that has nothing to do with MS would be just the thing sometimes. We belong to the library's group monthly book club, essentially, where we read a book together every month and get together and discuss it. We have, of course, church. There's other groups that you can belong to just because you're interested in the topic, not necessarily because you want to be really active in the group, but just to kind of get out there, meet some people, find out what's going on. There are so many different activities in the community that you could be a part of. And some of them, as I said, don't even require that you leave your house. A number of these groups meet online. Now here's another good one. Embrace distractions. They say managing stress and finding peace when the walls are closing in and the visits end is rough. I'm not a FaceTime type girl, frankly. I found chatting in the bezzyms app is a huge distraction in a good way. Otherwise, I have been very conscious of what my body and symptoms are saying. Meditation, prayer mostly, has kept me sane. Movie time with the kids keeps me laughing, and walking on the beach reminds me this too shall pass. I like her attitude. It's very positive. This idea of distractions, I think, is important because when I'm going to speak for myself, and you can tell me if this is true for you as well, but for me, anything that threatens to take me off the track that I have decided I'm going to be on, the plan that I have for that hour or that day, I would consider a distraction, and my gut reaction on every one of those is it's unwelcome, because I really wanted to stick to what I was doing because I felt like I had control over that. Any distraction threatens that control. But what I find is that even without having MS, I was sort of that way. So the MS just makes it worse. And I have to work a little harder to turn that initial fear or reluctance into a willingness to find out, well, this distraction might actually be something that I will either appreciate or even enjoy, or something that was important, that sometimes you have to be interruptible. So a distraction, you just really have to think about why distractions are unwelcome and what you might do to change your attitude about them. Your next suggestion is to focus on balance. And the quote here is, I try to keep a balance in my life by spending time by myself, resting, doing the physical things I need to do to run my life, spending time talking to or being with friends and family, and painting watercolors. I also work hard on being thankful for the things that I have in my life and try to avoid looking at the things I don't have. This usually keeps me very content. Now, she sounds like more like she's talking about having a positive attitude, and I do think that's very important. But as far as the balance, she's describing a variety of activities to balance so that she's not so focused on any one thing. I don't know. I guess I would say there's good and bad in that. I just was watching something yesterday where the person said, you really can only commit yourself to 3 things at most as an ongoing routine, something that you're committed to. And that was a person who didn't have MS. And I thought, well, 3 is actually a pretty good number for someone with MS. And obviously, this MS video blog that I do is one of the things. And then I have church as another of my things. Gosh, I guess that only leaves me with one other thing. So I better be really choosy about what that is. I think that you can do anything as a one-off or once in a while kind of thing. And I would put camping in that category. But if there's something you're going to be doing routinely, day in, day out, thinking about it, participating in it, 3 is probably a really good number. So think about your 3. Pick with care, and if you find that any one of those 3 is causing you more stress than enjoyment, you might want to rethink that one and maybe focus on something else. Now, this one is so important. Make time for laughter. Here's a stat that I found on a website from the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor. And the question is, do children laugh much more often than adults do? As they say here, we often hear the claim that children laugh much more frequently than adults do. Many numbers are thrown around, but I've heard some claims that children laugh more than 300 times a day, whereas adults laugh less than 20 times a day. Well, we don't know whether that number is true or not, but regardless, I think that we don't laugh as much as we should, and having a disability also, I think, decreases the number of times in a day you find something genuinely funny. So I would recommend that you find reasons to laugh. Now, if you have grandchildren around, or children even, you're going to have times that you want to laugh. Now, if you're a parent, those times of laughter might be punctuated by times of frustration, but grandchildren tend to be laugh and have fun with them and then send them home with their parents. So maybe that's a little bit easier. You can watch comedy movies. You can watch comedy skits. You can do all of that by going out online. The one thing I would suggest against, though, is that a lot of adult laughter tends to be at the expense of somebody. So I do not recommend that. I think if you're going to be laughing, laugh out of joy and not out of one-upmanship or spitefulness even. I'm not suggesting that any of us would do such a thing, but laughter covers an awful lot of ground. And I do know some folks who spend more of their time laughing at others than with them, and I don't really think that that's helpful on any level. The bottom line, as they say, is that living with MS can feel isolated, but putting yourself out there can go a long way toward managing your condition and living a more joyful life. Well, I guess the last point that I want to make is that multiple sclerosis tends to be a disease that creates kind of a hyperactive response. Our immune system is hyperactive, a lot of our reactions are hyperactive. So it really should come as no surprise that if social isolation is bad for the general population, it's probably even worse for those of us with MS because our reactions to things are so much more pronounced than for the general population. But this reinforces the importance of not letting ourselves get involved in situations that are not positive. Not all social contact is good social contact, right? Just ask any teenager that's being bullied through the internet. But even though I think most of us, once we're adults, don't face too much of that, there's still an awful lot of negativity or neediness or downright toxicity that we can get ourselves entangled with if we just say, well, I'm just going to throw myself out there and any social contact is better than none. I don't know about that because stress is the great enemy of multiple sclerosis. It makes our symptoms worse, and it probably makes our disease worse at some level. So if you are finding yourself in a social connection that's causing you a lot of stress, you might think twice about that. I know that some relationships are not as easy to distance yourself from, but some are. If you've joined an organization or you've made a friend and you're finding that the demands on you or the emotional drain that you're feeling is just too much, step back. Find something else. There's so many other ways that you can stay connected, as we've discussed already. Just don't let yourself get in a situation that's harmful to you. Trust your judgment on what that means. I know sometimes we can't avoid it, or sometimes we actually have to undertake situations because of necessity. That might not be the most fun, but that's a different thing. I think if it's a voluntary association, you can just sort of unvolunteer. Well, that's about all I had for you today. And as always, I'm really stressing here to take really good care of yourself, and that this is one big way to do that. So do take good care of yourself. I'm going to see you again in my next video.